If you're a wrestling booker, one of the biggest problems you might have to deal with on a regular basis is the fact that everyone on your roster wants a push. And sure, many of them have a valid case when it comes to why they deserve this, but the reality remains, there's only so much time you'll have to devote to them each and every week. So that's where the juggling act of knowing who to elevate at what particular moment comes into play. And even if this only means giving them a mini push, at least it's something. But what are the most notable examples of these in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, so join us as we take a deep dive into mini pushes, wrestling's short-lived shoves. And if we're going to start anywhere, we can't think of a better point than with a man who, while he may have gone on to become a main eventer and even world champion again later on in his career, only got to have a one-day reign with the top prize in 1998, and that's KANE. But why did the Big Red Machine only get 24 hours with this title back then? After all, this was arguably the point where his character was at its strongest, as still pretty much being unkillable in fans' eyes, he was believable as the Michael Myers-esque horror movie villain. Well, if you want an answer to that, you only have to look at who else was on the roster then, because 98 was far and away the year of Steve Austin. And with him being the focus then, it meant he'd hold the belt for the better part of the year. That said, there would be a brief interruption in his reign at June 28th's King of the Ring pay-per-view, because there he would go up against KANE in a First Blood match and ended up dropping the belt to him. Yes, well, this show is mostly remembered now for the Hell in a Cell bout earlier in the show, which saw Mick Foley take two of the most insane bumps in wrestling history. It was also the night where Glenn Jacobs briefly reached the top of the mountain after dethroning the biggest star in the entire industry. Of course, this would end up being short-lived though, as the next night on Raw, he'd drop it right back to Stone Cold in the rematch. And all that really begs the question, why do the title change at all then? Well, a couple of reasons as it happened. First of all, Vince Russo thought it would be a nice twist to get fans to continue tuning in so as to see what would happen next. On top of that, KANE was so massively over at this point that it felt like giving him a token run with the belt would be a nice reward for the good work he'd done in getting the character over as the best villain the company had seen since the early days of The Undertaker. And as it happened, a thank you for a job well done was also the reason that our next entrant got a one-day title run in 2016. That said, when it came to ZACK RYDER, it would be the Intercontinental title belt he would win instead. Yes, ZACK RYDER, the poster child for someone who had gotten over on their own merit and was then subsequently punished by management as a result. Of course, he's managed to rebuild his career somewhat since then by doing well on the indie circuit as Matt Cardona, but back in the early 2010s, he was briefly so over that he could have been a legitimate WWE main eventer. But given the fact that Vince McMahon had not masterminded this push himself, he felt the strange need to burn money and destroy this opportunity by squashing Ryder at every turn and killing his momentum stone dead. So pretty soon after this, Long Island Ice Z would return to the lower mid-card, where it was expected he would spend the remainder of his days wallowing in obscurity. That was until WrestleMania 32 on April 3, 2016, however, as it was there that, for one night, Ryder would return to prominence when he won a ladder match to become the new Intercontinental Champion. Sure, it was a moment which, for many, had come 5 years too late, but even still, it was something to show the company still believed in the perennial mid-carder. And even if Zack would end up dropping the belt back to The Miz the next night on Raw, at least he got to have that brief moment in the sun, with this ending up serving as an apology of sorts for the way he was fumbled back in 2011. Of course, sometimes a push being short-lived wasn't always what was in the original plans though. No, sometimes it was meant to lead to something far greater, but had to be halted due to issues with the performer themselves. And if you want a perfect example of this in action, you need look no further than what happened with William Regal after he won the King of the Ring in 2008. Now, for modern fans who only know Regal as the general manager of NXT or the mentor to the Blackpool Combat Club, it's easy to forget that, while he was an active wrestler, he was amongst the greatest ever to lace up a pair of boots. In fact, you could make a solid argument that he's the best performer to ever do it who never went on to win a world title. That said, he almost did get to check this mark off his bucket list in 2008 because here, while he was in the middle of an excellent run as the heel GM of Raw, he'd book himself into the King of the Ring tournament and then go on to win the whole thing. After that, with him having both on-screen booking power and now the added confidence in knowing that he was still the best wrestler on the roster, His ego would only grow that much more as he became something of a megalomaniacal tyrant. Seriously, you could argue that, as an on-screen character, this period marked the highest highs the Englishman was ever able to reach, as week in and week out, he'd be one of the most entertaining parts of the show, ruling everything with an iron thumb and making life a living hell for anyone who crossed him. So over did he get during this time. In fact, there were even some initial plans to put the WWE title on him for a while. That said, these plans would have to be scrapped when Regal would fail a drug test and be suspended. This then would see Regal be pulled from TV in early 2009. However, since this time, Regal has gone on record to say that he hadn't broken the company's wellness policy and the drug test was an anomaly. Unfortunately though, the damage had already been done in management's eyes, as, following that, they would scrap his push and never trust him in a position of such prominence again. But at least he can take some solace in the fact that he's not the only member of the Blackpool Combat Club whose push to the WWE main event scene was short-lived. And that's because, a half-decade later in 2014, Cesaro would find out firsthand that being a Paul Heyman guy didn't necessarily mean you were going to stay at the top forever. Of course, it wasn't for fans' lack of desire to see this though, because for years prior, the Swiss Superman had been regarded as one of the best and most underutilized wrestlers in the world. And that was why they were so excited when, after winning the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal at WrestleMania 30, he'd come out the next night on Raw to announce that he was the newest client of Paul Heyman. After all, if anyone could take someone to new heights, it was Heyman. You just had to look towards the likes of Brock Lesnar and CM Punk if you wanted evidence of that. Unfortunately for Cesaro, however, it soon became apparent that a similar trajectory just wasn't in the cards for him. No, instead, the decision to pair him up with the former ECW owner appeared to have been made so that Heyman could remain on TV every week and keep Brock Lesnar fresh in people's minds following his defeat of The Undertaker at the Showcase of the Immortals. So as the months went on, Cesaro's push would flounder as he increasingly became a background character in his own story. And this would foster a resentment within him which saw him spend the next decade determined to prove that he could grab that ever-elusive brass ring even if Vince McMahon had no intention of offering it. Of course, he would eventually have to go over to All Elite Wrestling to achieve this, and he's not alone in that either, because just a couple of years prior, Brody Lee had done the same. That said, he almost never had to do this at all, because in 2017, when he was still working for WWE as Luke Harper, he got a brief push of his own which many felt would finally see him reach the next level. That's right, after spending the prior 5 years largely being a background character in the Wyatt family story, Harper finally got a chance to shine when someone in management realized he had all the tools required to become a modern-day Bruiser Brody. And so a push would begin to present itself for him soon thereafter when, upon Randy Orton seemingly joining forces with the Wyatts in late 2016, the big man began acting suspicious of the new recruit, believing him to be a mole trying to destroy them from the inside. But while he would eventually be proven right in this suspicion, he wasn't able to convince his leader, Bray Wyatt, at the time. No, in fact, in early 2017, after Harper and Orton had gone one-on-one during an episode of SmackDown, Bray would side with the Viper to the point that he'd actually deliver his sister Abigail to his now former recruit and send him packing from the family altogether from there. If there was a silver lining to this, however, it was that, now out from under the shadow of his leader, the big man would finally get a chance to have a singles run. Unfortunately though, this singles run would prove to be short-lived because after being apparently unimpressed with what he was seeing, Vince McMahon would choose to instead reunite Harper with his old teammate Eric Rowan in April of that year, as they from there went on to form the Bludgeon Brothers. Yes, with the boss having a notoriously short attention span when it came to pushing people at this point, there just wasn't enough time for Luke Harper to establish himself before he was returned to the tag team division. Still, it could have been worse. He could have just been saddled with the Mighty Mouse gimmick Adrian Neville was given when he first joined the WWE main roster in January of 2015. And the reason we say this one is bad is because, despite it marking the point where Neville would get a short-lived push, it was a gimmick which was always going to act as an albatross around his neck on account of how cheesy it was. Seriously, to see the Englishman come out there each and every week wearing a cape and trying to portray himself as such a cartoon-esque character just didn't gel with the performer people had come to know and love during his time down in NXT, where he was their world champion. Still, he made the best he could of it at the time. And it wasn't as if Vince McMahon didn't see the whole gimmick as a positive, because during his early weeks on the roster, the man now known as AEW's Pac would get to shine in some great bouts against the likes of Seth Rollins, at one point even almost dethroning the then WWE champion. And even after this was done, Neville would still maintain a solid spot in the mid-card when, over the course of the summer, he'd get into a notable feud with Stardust, which saw him take part in a big celebrity tag team match at that year's SummerSlam with Arrow star Stephen Amell in his corner. Of course, as time went on though, he would begin being slotted into more of a mid-card role, as with him being only 5'8" in height, he just didn't fit into the narrow parameters of what Vince McMahon thought a star could be. But while his frustrations over this would eventually see him leave the company in 2017 and find much more success elsewhere, when it comes to another cruiserweight on the roster, Kalisto remained with WWE until 2021 and was hoping that he'd one day get another push like he did in 2015 when he won the United States title. Yes, back during the mid-2010s, after having spent the years prior working his way up the ranks of NXT and then the main roster tag team division, management decided that the high-flying luchador might have what it took to become the company's next big Latino star. And that was why, on the January 11th episode of Raw in 2015, he'd get a sudden push up the card when he defeated Alberto Del Rio to become the new US champion. From there then, things looked to be going well, at least for a while, because across the rest of the winter and into the spring, Kalisto would successfully defend his belt against all comers. Unfortunately for him though, the curse of being in WWE and having his height start with a 5 would come back to bite him when, by July of that year, he'd have lost his title and would have been moved over to SmackDown, where any momentum he'd built up was quickly snuffed out. Of course, it didn't help that it was somewhere around this time that he'd also shown his limited mic skills with an all-time bad Lucha Thing promo. But if the company really were determined to keep going with him at this point, they could have always given him a manager to act as a mouthpiece. After all, that's what they did with our next subject, because in 2016, after having spent a lengthy run in the tag team division as one half of the primetime players, Darren Young would finally get a singles push when he joined forces with Bob Backlund. And yes, this was Backlund in full mid-90s mode, playing his crazed old man character. So even if Young wasn't the best talker on the roster, he didn't have to worry about that, because Bob had it covered while he concentrated on delivering in-ring. However, Backlund's campaign to make Darren Young great again would all ultimately fail, as over the coming weeks, Young would gradually get lost in the mix of storylines on the show. Still, that wasn't to say that there weren't some bright spots to the whole thing, as during this period, Young would get to raise his stock by feuding with the likes of Alberto Del Rio and The Miz over the Intercontinental title. Even if this was the case though, by the time the summer came around, the general feeling of indifference towards the gimmick, combined with the fact that Vince McMahon had apparently gotten bored and moved on to someone else, meant that Darren Young would be returned to the tag team division when he reunited with Titus O'Neil. But at least he got to keep a regular role on TV for a while after his push came to an end, so it wasn't all that bad. After all, it could have been a situation like Dabba-Kato underwent in 2020, because following his brief flirtation with the upper card while he was a part of Raw Underground, he'd really have nowhere to go from there but down. Of course, at first glance, it's easy to see why Vince McMahon wanted to have this Polish former football player on his roster, because with him looming over everyone else at 6'9" and weighing 350 pounds, he certainly stood out from the crowd. That said, despite initially signing with WWE in 2016, it wouldn't be until 4 years later that he made his full-time main roster debut, with his only notable appearance prior to this being a spot in the Greatest Royal Rumble pay-per-view. And while for the most part, the easy way to debut a giant at this point would have been to have him shock the live audience by destroying a beloved fan favorite, the fact that the world was in shutdown and no fans were in attendance in the summer of 2020 meant that this method would have to be altered somewhat. So in trying to come up with something new then, the boss would fall upon the idea of Raw Underground, a segment which started appearing on the third hour of Raw throughout this period and which sold itself on having more of a Fight Club aesthetic. But while it would initially look like wrestlers with legit shoot skills such as Dolph Ziggler and Otis were going to be the main beneficiaries of this, it quickly became apparent that the real reason behind the gimmick was to get Dabba-Kato over as a killer. And this meant that as the weeks went on, he'd destroy everyone in his path, all up until the point he came up against Braun Strowman, that was, because here, on the September 21st episode of the Red Brand, his winning streak would come to a sharp end. Yes, in record time, WWE decided they weren't happy with the progress of the big man, and so, before he could ever actually make it into a formal WWE ring, his push would be scrapped and he'd be sent back to the drawing board without having had a single official match. And since then, he's found himself rebranded as Commander Aziz, the Heavy of Apollo Crews. So at the very least, he does have a role in the company for the time being. And even if this is lower card purgatory, it's not always the worst place to be, as a jobber can always get an unexpected push if the stars align. And if you want evidence of this, just ask Barry Horowitz. That's right, in the mid-90s, there were two people battling it out for the spot of top enhancement talent on WWF TV, Steve Lombardi and Barry Horowitz. Of course, things would briefly change for the latter in 1995 though, as it was then they'd receive an unexpected push up the card for the first time in their career. But why had Vince McMahon chosen to suddenly push the jobber after all these years? Well, the reason for that was at this point in time, he was so light on stars, he was throwing everything he could at the wall in hopes that something would stick. And this saw Horowitz begin turning things around in July of that year when he scored a pinfall win over Skip of the Body Donnas. Following that, he'd rack up even more wins on subsequent episodes of Raw and Superstars, with this all leading to him getting a pay-per-view match at that August SummerSlam where he would score yet another victory over Skip. So at this point, you would have been forgiven for thinking the Florida native was going to start getting pushed further up the card. Unfortunately though, no matter how hard the company had hoped he might reach Intercontinental title level here, Horowitz was unable to compete with the impressive mid-card roster the company had at the time. So realizing this then, Vince McMahon would begin easing him back down the card, returning him to the enhancement talent status he had been in before, and formally closing the book on his brief push. Yes, sometimes pushes don't work out because the performer in question isn't quite ready for it. That said, this argument certainly couldn't be applied to our next entry today, because in the case of Evan Bourne, he's always been one of the best cruiserweights of his generation. But WWE were already well aware of this when they brought him up to the main roster in 2008, and that was exactly why they gave him a push right out of the gate at this point. But what did his push involve? Well, after getting a chance to establish himself on the ECW brand during his early months there, Bourne would get to have a pay-per-view encounter with then ECW champion Matt Hardy after fans voted him into the spot at October 26th, Cyber Sunday. So seeing how over he was getting, WWE officials would decide to move him over to Raw where, starting in June of 2009, he'd get to rub shoulders with major stars such as Randy Orton, with him here immediately creating a highlight moment by taking what was probably, at the time, the greatest RKO ever. Sadly though, things would start to falter at this point because with him being yet another example of someone who was pigeonholed as a cruiserweight, Vince McMahon would soon begin to lose interest in the high flyer, and before long, would have moved on to someone else. But while this would see him fall down the card from there, it wouldn't be all that bad, because he would get to form a tag team with Kofi Kingston named Air Boom that kept both men relevant and regularly on TV for a while. So maybe the lesson to be learned here then is, if you're someone who's given a push that proves to be short-lived, you better try and find a spot for yourself somewhere else quickly, otherwise you're liable to disappear into obscurity. And if you do this, who knows, your next opportunity could come along at any time. And maybe this time, it won't be a mini push. Now maybe it'll finally be the big one instead.